Can I just say to you that I have personally tried my very best to get coverage for this event in a host of local newspapers throughout Hampshire with very, very limited success. So limited has that success been that I also, in addition to press releases, actually paid for 5,000 flyers, which were these large flyers, to be distributed in one of the weekly free newspapers to areas around the centre of Winchester and also around Alston. It turned out that they were not delivered. And whatever you think of it, you know, cock up or conspiracy, it just brings it home to you how difficult a job we in the eurosceptic movement have in persuading local newspapers to give us coverage. Now, I've decided, and this is something that I'm just doing on a personal basis, but I hope you will support it, I've decided to take on some of these local newspapers, and as a start I have produced a printed postcard which will be handed out to you now, which is addressed to the editor of the Hampshire Chronicle, who are in fact one of the worst offenders as far as I'm concerned. They are part of a group called NewsQuest Group Limited that control a very large number of other local newspapers right throughout the south coast of England. They are controlled, in turn, by an American conglomerate called the Gannett Group. Now, it seems to me that since the Hampshire Chronicle was bought out by this group about 12 months ago, they have changed their attitude, and they now, in fact, will not give any sort of coverage to anything that looks like being confrontational. I get the impression that all these newspapers are now concerned about projecting is an image of happy families on Valium. And I think it's about time that we challenge that view. So I have produced this postcard, which I hope that you will fill in and leave for us to photocopy and then post. And it says, "Dear Editor, I am dissatisfied with the lack of coverage that your newspaper gives to the views of local people like me, who believe that our laws should be made exclusively and solely by our own Westminster Parliament, whom we can dismiss, and not be dictated by the European Commission, whom we cannot. Yours faithfully." I do hope that if you feel like me that we have to do something, that you will sign and print your name and address and hand those in to the stewards. Thank you very much. Now, moving on very quickly now to the next stage of our proceedings. I have mislaid my programme, but thank you very much. We now move to a session that should have started at 20 to 2. We are going to have to try and curtail, I'm afraid, some question time, but in an effort to make sure that we are out of here as required by Winchester City Council by 4 p.m. So, we have Guy Herbert, who is the General Secretary of the NO2ID Campaign. I asked him for a brief biographical introduction, and I can do no better, I think, than to actually read out what he said to me. Guy Herbert was born in Oxford longer ago than you might like to think, although, goodness me, he looks pretty good on it to me. He's worked for most of the past 25 years in one phase of publishing or another, from retail bookselling to literary agency, and is now a business affairs consultant covering computer games as well as conventional literary and film properties. When, that is, he is not volunteering as the General Secretary of the NO2ID Campaign, a post he has held since the end of 2004. So Guy Herbert will be speaking to us today on the totalitarian trend towards total state control and surveillance, and I have great pleasure in welcoming on your behalf Guy Herbert.
Ladies and gentlemen, what I don't have for you today is a series of exciting anecdotes. I don't have conspiracy theories put forward under the cover of privileged information. What I have for you is a discussion of things that you can check in the public record. The word that I'm going to suggest is the most important in my title is actually trend. Totalitarian is the biggest word in the title. It's a word we owe to Mussolini. It denotes a state that covers the whole of life. And we've heard a lot today about controlling our own affairs. I'd like to suggest to you that there is a danger of controlling our own affairs too much, that our own government, as much as any other government, is in danger of damaging the Britain and the British way of life that we know and love. It's often suggested, and the context of an eurosceptic conference might suggest, that ID cards come from Brussels. They don't. Yes, they have them on the continent. It's very often said by people who are pro-ID card, and we'll get to what being pro-ID card means in just a moment, that they're not harmful. Our European cousins have them. They don't do any harm there. People are free in France too. Or it's said by politicians putting forward a pro-ID card stance. This is all part of meeting our European obligations for identity documents. It isn't. It isn't, because not all European countries do have identity cards. Not all of them have national registers, and most of those countries that do have identity cards have nothing like the system that is being put into place in this country. What we're seeing very often is the EU or international obligations, broader international obligations, being used as a means of policy laundering for a policy that the government would like to impose upon us. It's not a new trend any more than it's an EU trend. There has been a desire in this country to have a national register since before the First World War. The First World War introduced the first national register in the National Registration Act of 1915. This was thought to be a jolly good idea for controlling rationing. It didn't work terribly well, but they had another go. Having dropped the emergency registration, they had another go when the emergency came about in the Second World War. That worked just a little bit better. It had three purposes when it was created. It was for national security, a wonderful excuse for everything. It was for controlling the ration, and it was for maintaining conscription. By the time the card was abolished, after 7 years of existence in peacetime, in 1952, it was used for 39 different government agencies and had as many, depending on how you count them, as 63 official functions. They're very, very useful to bureaucrats, you see. And that's really why the trend now. It's a global trend. It's not just here. It's not just in the European EID programs, which are being very broadly canvassed now to upgrade and make more exciting the existing systems in Europe. In France, in due course, you may not go to the local mairie and get a laminated piece of card, as you currently do now, but you will have to go through a proper national registration programme, although the French equivalent of Privacy International was asked by the last Prime Minister to look into this and said that they didn't think it was a terribly good idea for privacy. It's a global trend because governments are entranced by new technology. They love computers. And they are concerned that if they don't have enough information about us, that we will be out of control. And that's where one of the big pressures comes at the moment for what is very closely linked with identity cards, the e-borders programme comes from. E-borders, the fancy passports that you now will, many of you have, are designed to cough up their information at border control in electronic form so that it can be forwarded with a border control likes. And this is quite explicitly part of controlling the amount of information that is known about passengers. After 9/11, it is thought that, quite apart from stopping people taking knives on planes, that knowing where they're going and where they've come from is a good idea. It's never really explained why that is the case. And it is, I suggest, part of this new obsession. There's a database for everything. It used to be called joined-up government at one stage. Now, joined-up government was, when it was first introduced as a phrase by the present government, being waved around as a suggestion that we be grown up about things. Let's have policies that interlink with one another. Let's have a philosophy that is coherent in government. Nothing very much to object to there. What joined-up government has now turned into is a very technocratic programme for joining together government departments and government information. And that's the source of the new obsession. There's a database for everything. There's a database for the National Health Service. There's a database for your children. In fact, there's several databases for your children. There are databases in the Department of Education already existing with unique pupil numbers and connections programs that link your children to people who want to sell them sneakers. And but there is now a grander database intended to comprise a record of every child in the country and link together all the people who might be dealing with that child. There's a National Health Service database called Connecting for Health, which is supposed to link all your medical records, wherever they may be, and whether or not they're the sort of medical records that are sectioned off from your doctor for privacy purposes, which some people's medical records are, to be linked in a single database that can be accessed by medical staff, but also by Department of Health staff in something called the Secondary Uses System, which is a means for many, many health service bureaucracies to collate and use the information for their own bureaucratic purposes. There are ANPR databases, automatic number plate recognition databases. You're not just photographed on a speed camera, which you may or may not like, and many people seem to regard the ability to speed as a freedom we should have more of. But whether or not you're prosecuted for the immediate offence, that the more and more cameras in the streets are enabled to, with digital technology, to allow them to flash your number to a central database so that a record of your position is kept. And in the spring, I was going to say, in the Christmas season of 2005, the Association of Chief Police Officers proudly announced as a Christmas present to us all that Britain would be the first country in which every car journey was logged. The name for it now is transformational government. It's actually called transformational government enabled by technology. If you look at the Cabinet Office website, you can read their rather turgid paper justifying this. And the heart of transformational government is something called data sharing. It's not just collecting data from one place and using it for one purpose. It's collecting data from all sorts of places and using it for other purposes that you never thought it was being given for. And the only way you can do that is by linking it up. How is it to be linked up? Well, you need some sort of index, some sort of cross-reference, some sort of means of matching one person with one record that is unique to them. You need to give them a number, in essence. And for all the flummery surrounding it, that is the central bureaucratic purpose of the National Identity Register and identity cards. If you read through Schedule 1 to the Identity Cards Act, which Mark was alluding to this morning, among the 50 items or categories of information that are to be collected about every individual in the country are the numbers of other designated documents. Designated documents being documents that, in order to obtain which, there are probably too many relatives in that sentence, you need to have an identity card in the grand Home Office scheme of things. That means that your driving licence, various other licences, a Criminal Records Bureau certificate. Oh, there's another database I'd forgotten about. Your Criminal Records Bureau certificate, perhaps your police records, perhaps your... that would not be in the present legislation, I should say, but perhaps the National DNA Database might also be linked to that one way or another. All those things are being indexed to one another by this central record, and that maintains the coherence of all government data. So when ministers assure us, oh, well, there'll be very little information on the database, very little information kept about you on the identity cards database. Firstly, they're lying, because there's actually, when you look at Schedule 1, quite a lot of information, and it will build up over time as information changes. It won't be thrown away. That's not the way the official records work. As information changes, it will be built up, but also all those interlocking numbers allow different databases containing different information about you to be cross-referenced. So the capacity to keep very small amounts of data in the imagination of ministers on a central index makes accessible vast, huge amounts, in theory, of other information that is held on you by one government department or another, or perhaps even by private or agencies, since it is the plan that you will be required to produce identification for a number of private purposes. You can read about some of those purposes in the what was called the regulatory impact assessment produced by the Home Office. They would include buying a mobile phone, renting property, opening a bank account. All of those are purposes for which the Home Office thinks you ought to verify your identity. And when you verify your identity, a record will be kept of the fact that you did so at the Home Office. Using the National Health Service is another one of those cases. So it's a grand bureaucratic scheme for collecting information. What do they want to do with that information? There isn't a conspiracy. There's no particular desire to do anything more than collect information. That's what bureaucrats do. But there is a problem with that. We have changed suddenly from having a concept of the person, as A.J.P. Taylor famously wrote in his introduction to his volume of the Oxford English History, where an Englishman before the First World War could go through the entirety of his life without having any contact with the government apart from the post office. To, I'm misquoting there perhaps, but I'm paraphrasing, to a situation where there is one file on us kept from birth to death, and that file is effectively the person. Moving from a common law state where our lives are governed by our interactions with others, to a new concept of a person where our lives are governed by our interaction with one entity, with the state. It's the nationalisation of all our lives and all of our lives. The trouble is that information confers control, and that's the totalitarian trend. It's not intended as totalitarianism. Mr. Blair didn't wake up one morning and say, what I want to do is control what everybody does in all their lives all the time. And to do it, I will set up a magnificent national identity register and will link all the data together. I think the present generation of government ministers is the last generation of ministers, last generation of politicians who have no personal direct experience of computers. They've always had somebody else to do that for them. So they do think computers are a bit magic. And so they're very credulous about what can be achieved with computers, and they don't necessarily believe that what government does with computers can go wrong, can be oppressive, can cause any of the snafus that we are used to when dealing with large institutions with computers at their back, computers that say no, more often than not. What the minutiae collected on our lives, however, offer is the means for control. And the means for control having been taken, control is not likely to be long after. That's the danger. It always seems like a good idea to change this or that for public safety, for good reasons and bad reasons. But these controls on our lives don't go away. So handing the government that ultimate tool, as it will be seen, of bureaucratic manipulation is a bad idea. Not because of any of the specific defects in the system to which we could allude, and perhaps to which we could devote an entire seminar, but it is the fact of offering that massive bureaucratic tool. And once that control is there, then indeed fears about the EU, fears about broader international governance are fully justified. Because once the tool is there, it can be used by whoever its hands, whoever's hands it falls into. Data is more collected on British citizens already than any other citizens of the EU, more or less. And we have laxer laws about what's done with it than many of the other European countries. Resistance to data retention in relation to communications data, for example, came from Germany. It did not come from our own government, which was the government agitating for communications data to be held. That's who you ring, when you ring them, and your telephone call length. Not what you say. That can't be read without a warrant, but they know who you call. Once that control is there, it can be exercised, and we're already seeing how it might be exercised through the EU itself, because we have data sharing across borders. Not only do we have passenger travel data, which is communicated ahead to any country, effectively any country, and particularly to the US, about passengers on aircraft, but we have now rolling up the Prüm Treaty, whereby information can be shared for the purposes of various criminal investigations, and they need not necessarily be investigations in train with crimes attached to them. There are all sorts of data sharing conventions in place that allow more data sharing than that, which differentially affects British people worse. So strangely, we've moved from a situation where we had one of the most liberal constitutions in Europe to an effective constitution that is close to totalitarian. And everything that is known about you by our government is also available to other governments. Leaving the EU is not sufficient to solve that problem. It's a homegrown problem. It's a problem that's been brewing up since 1915 and the National Registration Act then. It's a problem that's been brewing up every time a national registration proposal was brought forward, which has happened roughly once a decade ever since. And it's a problem that is now being developed out there in the nearest, I suppose, registration centre, interrogation centre is in Southampton from here. But in due course, everybody from Winchester who renews a passport will have to go to Southampton and ask a question, answer a questionnaire based on a dossier compiled upon them just to check all the records are correct before they go into the National Register. It's happening now. It's happening as a result of our government, not the EU, and the EU will make use of it, but our government is going to get that information first, and it's our government we have to do something about. The way you can do something about it is tell other people what's happening, tell them the facts. The facts are readily available from NO2ID. If you go out to, fully referenced, if you go out to the table at the back after the session is over, or after the afternoon is over, there's a series of these brochures which tell you about NO2ID. They tell you a good deal about the National Identity Register. They give you references to the original documents. There are forms to join NO2ID, which also appear on the leaflets that I've handed round earlier. And for those of you who are already very keen, there's a booklet on how to make the case to other people about this. Because people are, at the moment, very, very complacent about their freedoms. We've grown up in a country where we're used to being free, and so people don't quite care as much as they do in some other parts of Europe. We have to make them care before it's too late.
Thank you very much, Guy, and that was an extremely thought-provoking talk, I thought, and in fact I think that it terrifies one or two of us, certainly me. I'm sure you'll have some questions now. Can I start with the gentleman there at the end of the row with the beard?
Would you agree that if identity cards are introduced, the time will come in a not too near distant future when we'll need identity cards to buy a loaf of bread? It might sound funny, but I'm being very serious.
Well, the Home Office... sorry.
Could you stand?
Okay.
Because the
Yeah,
camera
okay.
misses you.
The Home Office did in fact conduct some focus groups to determine what people's resistance was to producing identity cards for verification at purchases of £200 or more, and producing identity cards just as for a visual check at £100 or more. The result was inconclusive.
Gentleman there, and then I'll take it.
I think most people's objection to ID cards in this country comes from the cost of having them put in. I mean, let me put the contrary argument. If I want to open a bank account, I've got to produce a bill, a utility bill, a passport, a driving licence, all that stuff before I can even open a bank account. There are people who would say that if an ID card was cheap, and I agree with you about too much data on it, but if it was just a cheap, simple means of identifying yourself sufficiently to be able to do something like opening a bank account, most people in this country would say, that's okay.
I think everybody in this room that I can see is old enough to remember when you didn't have to do that to produce a bank account. It's a very recent innovation. To justify policy by what is already an unnecessary imposition on the citizen and making life easier to jump through the hoops that have been set up for us is, I think, a very slippery slope. I think I can take one more and then...
Right. The gentleman there with the blue shirt.
Yep.
Yes, I would just say that I'd been out for a drink at lunchtime, and two people asked for their ID for a £5 purchase at a drink. So it does happen for all sorts of purchases. But the thing about the bread, I think, would also apply. It's not really a question, so I think we should have one more.
Somebody who hasn't asked a question. Lady there in the middle.
What I'd like to know is that as people know so much about us, you know, the business of collating information, how come we have all these illegal immigrants that nobody knows anything about at all? I mean, the collation is marvellous, the idea, isn't it? But I mean, it seems to be only the indigenous population seems to be the recipient of all this data.
Well, that is, of course, one of the flaws in the government's suggestion that ID cards are specific against immigration. People who are illegal immigrants or suspected of being illegal immigrants can already be required by immigration officers to produce ID.
You see, one thing on the continent suspect an illegal immigrant, they can be asked for papers.
They can here too.
But they never are, obviously.
Okay, well, I'll just take one very quick one there. I think it's
If
John
I
Clark.
receive mine, I will destroy it in the fire. Can you tell me whether there's going to be a punishment or a prison service to do that?
I believe up to 51 weeks imprisonment for deliberate
Right,
destruction.
I'll go to prison.
So you don't lose your seat in the European Parliament, is that the idea?
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. That troublemaker down the front wants to ask something.
Well, I'm not sure that we have any more time, and he's
I give away happily,
One last
but I haven't got a lot of time.
Troublemaker, moi? Guy, I actually agree with almost all you say. I'm sure some people at Five probably think you're a terrible subversive. I don't. But would you agree with this, that should we, when we next go to war, there are entirely different national security arguments for a wartime-only identity card? And I'm speaking of a card that would be abandoned as soon as the war was over.
Conceivably there are. I mean, the people I've spoken to in the intelligence services are quite sceptical, actually, of the current arrangement, and say, well, what is it for, really? What they would like to be able to do is to dip in and out of data streams and to analyse behaviour, which is a very different business from running your life for you, which is the bureaucratic purpose of this system.
Thank you very much indeed. I think when Guy mentions that information confers control, that's when, in fact, it comes home to those of us who are here today because we believe that there should be a freedom for ourselves to run our own affairs in this country. We are also probably those people that believe in the freedom of the individual, almost libertarian. And that's, if you have those views, then this should be extremely worrying. It's the transmission, I think, of the information to an outside body that terrifies me. Thank you very much indeed, Guy Herbert, for coming on this afternoon. I'm sorry we had to curtail your time somewhat, but we do appreciate you coming. Thank you.